So we looked last time at the war as it played out mostly abroad, at how America's isolationist stance was moved slowly to the Marshall, how President Woodrow Wilson, who was an intellectual, a man comfortable in the world of ideas, he was and remains the only president to have earned a doctorate. He had a PhD in political science. Attending to especially to two of his congressional speeches, we looked at how this man who established his political life and won his second term as president on a stance of no war, on an anti-war stance, through those two speeches, we saw him develop the Wilsonian foreign policy position, which led the U.S. to war in 1917, and we will see has continued to lead America into foreign wars into today. A Wilsonian worldview is optimistic, it's idealistic, it rests on a firm sense of and adherence to American exceptionalism. Of course, it prefers peace, but what it requires is the promotion of liberally democratic, free market governments around the world. Wilson called it national self-determination. All the world's peoples should have access to it, and all the world's nations should self-determine a government that supports liberal democracy and a free market. Because, of course, this was unquestioned at the time. Wilson was seen, especially by Wilson, not by everyone, as we'll see, Wilson was seen by many at the time to be overly idealistic, overly optimistic. His drive to use America's providentially blessed power to establish a world order of peace and prosperity was seen by many to be naive. And it has proven to be, in this way, the insistence that global order requires that all nations self-determine to be the same kind of political and economic government, liberal democracy, and a free market. If the global order requires that everybody in the world adopt those in the interest of peace, well then, there will be war. And this we return to, we've seen this before, this is from 1905, a little earlier from the magazine Puck, and it's titled Peace. Because it turns out that not all peoples pick the same organizing principles. So Wilson sets out to make the world safe for democracy in World War I, and it seems to me that he was being honest here, he was being authentic, that he believed in this idealism, in its potential, that he believed that America was one of the champions of the rights of mankind, vindicating the principles of peace and justice, fighting for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples. He believes in this calling, and in his role as president to lead America to its higher purpose, to encourage America to act according to its better angels. We will make the world safe for democracy. Now it makes us think sort of war is peace, right? That's what it looks a lot like, and that's actually Orwell, who lives through this period, is born in 1903, but who writes that a little bit later. If you haven't read 1984, you really, do yourself the favor of picking that one up. So World War I began, as we saw, through a tragically spiraling momentum driven by industrialism and nationalism and the Wilsonian idealism that was articulated in the move to bring America into the war. That has itself followed its own tragically spiraling momentum into the present day, leading America on its globally militarized mission to liberate nations around the world, especially in the greater Middle East, and to provide aid and comfort and the blessings of liberty to the inhabitants of those nations. We will return to these themes. With World War I, though, America, under Wilson's charge, would make the world safe for democracy. Again, he said it a lot, we heard it a lot. Industrialization created its own post-war context of tragically spiraling momentum in cahoots with legally supported compulsory adherence to a particular brand of American civil religion. Making the world safe for democracy, we did not, some would say, attend to the, attend to the injustice against, we didn't support the liberty and security and equality of those on the home front. And we're going to look at this today in terms of especially three particular social circumstances. The first is the Espionage and Sedition Acts of the end of the American War era. The second is the labor movements and the plight of the American working class. And the third is race riots, the persistent and pervasive racially motivated violence of the time and the struggles of those facing racial and ethnic oppression and brutality. But we'll start with the Espionage Act, Espionage and the Sedition Act. Now remember, though, we've seen the federal government engaged in a war abroad for ostensibly idealistic reasons. reasons that were figured in terms of shared American values, American exceptionalism, and the universal moral mandates that that exceptional status was seen to support and to require. The Espionage Act was passed on June 15, 1917, 2 months after America's declaration of war in World War I. It gave postal officials authority to ban publication from the mails, so the postal authorities, post offices became an arm of censorship, and it made, quote, obstructing the draft through words a crime. So the Sedition Act was passed almost a year later, and with this one, America doubled down on the restrictions offered by the Espionage Act. The Sedition Act was passed on May 16, 1918, and extended the Espionage Act by defining as a federal offense a whole range of speech acts, a whole range of ways to use words. It was illegal under the Sedition Act to, and this is a quote, to utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the form of government of the United States, or the Constitution of the United States, or the military or naval forces of the United States. And you can see here a few of the examples of the propaganda posters that were made at the time of especially the Sedition Act, but also the Espionage Act. The language of the second act, the Sedition Act of 1918, allowed for the government more easily to target socialists and communists and anarchists and pacifists. It was a wartime provision, and the Supreme Court at the time upheld it. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did uphold it. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was writing for the majority, argued that the danger of war justified restricting First Amendment rights. That was the logic, and on the whole, America bought into that. These acts restricted free expression in the interest of national security. The most direct motivation for both was to protect the draft, which was, as you remember, instituted in May of 1917. There could be no dissent among the potential troops, and these acts criminalized dissent during wartime. And not even just actions against the state, but words could complicate or compromise the mythic corpus upon which support for the war explicitly rested. Wilson, remember, sought to elicit the pride of those who know that the day has come when America is privileged to spend her blood and her might for the principles that gave her birth and happiness and the peace which she has treasured. Right? America is privileged to do this in a very, exceptionalist, entitled way. So enter Eugene Debs. He lived from 1855 to 1926. He was born and buried in Terre Haute, Indiana. He was the son of poor immigrants to the U.S., and he was a humanist idealist. That was kind of his shtick. He was dedicated most specifically, but not exclusively, most specifically to the cause of workers. In 1893, he organized the first industrial union in the U.S., which is the American Railway Union in Chicago. He was also a co-founder of the International Workers of the World, also known as the Wobblies. You read a little bit about them. They were founded in 1905. He was a co-founder, and that was also in Chicago. The IWW is sort of a meta-union, mostly helping other groups to unionize, to strike, especially focused at its founding on striking for shorter hours and limiting child labor. He ran for president 5 times as the Socialist Party candidate. He got 6% of the vote running against Wilson in 1912, which is significant for a third party and a socialist. And in his last race in 1920, he campaigned from his jail cell. So why was he in jail? On June 16th, 1918, he gave a speech in Canton, Ohio, coming out, as he regularly and often did, against the war. The war, he claimed, was being waged not to make the world safe for democracy, as he'd been told, as we'd all been told, not for freedom, not for liberty and justice for all, to grant the oppressed people of the world over the opportunity to experience the blessings of liberty that America had secured. He says that's not what is happening here. He argued rather that the Great War, as it was known, this war to end all wars, was being fought by 65 million largely poor, mostly destitute soldiers in order to sustain the rule of capitalism and in order to foster the imperialism that the powerful in nations around the world had aspired to for centuries. And this is one of his quotes here. We'll see a variation on it in a second. He makes much of the same claims and indicts the powers that be on much the same grounds. as we've seen that Major General Smedley Butler will do in 1935. But at this time, in 1918, Butler himself is engaged in leadership on the front, and Debs is home arguing that all war is class war, and that it's the poor who pay the price. His claim is that the working class who fought and died in battles, who made what he did call the supreme sacrifice, so still a little bit of that redemptive violence notion, this does still count as the supreme sacrifice, that those working class combatants had never yet had a voice in either declaring war or making peace, as he says. In what he calls the ruling class or the master class here, that does that. They alone declare the war and they alone make the peace, he says. And America was at this point at war, mobilized in great numbers, both at the front and also in the newly transitioned factories, those industrial era centers of mass productivity that had only in the past decade and a half been built, and that in their youth had been very quickly repurposed to furnish the nations of the world with all the war-making material that a manufacturing powerhouse could provide. War was in the air for folks at home and for folks abroad. The boys were fighting and dying at the front, we were reminded constantly. To critique their project was to call into question the foundational values upon which and according to which America served, America fought, America went to war. Those foundational values couldn't be called into question, therefore don't call the war into question. This was the war that would make the world safe for democracy, after all. To argue against the war, to suggest that this grand enterprise shaping what was soon to be dubbed the Greatest Generation was in fact an enterprise built not on those sacred foundational values and principles, but rather on the ulterior motives of the powerful and the greedy. To do that would be tantamount in the minds of the powerful and of a majority of Americans, tantamount to standing against democracy, right? And that's what the enemy did. We could broach no such enemy at home. Morale depended upon concerted support. And so too did the future of the world, the blessings of liberty for our posterity, the posterity of all nations, American children, but also British children, Russian children, even German children. The nation wouldn't abide this sort of dissent, wouldn't allow the naysayers to compromise those high-minded Wilsonian ideals of worldwide peace and justice and freedom and democracy. So that's the logic. That's the motivation for the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act from 1917 and 1918. Debs was an important target in that he was openly, vocally, and prominently against the war, an unrepentant heretic in the Church of Wilson's providential nationalism. Also, his connection to the IWW, which was itself under attack. He was a declared socialist. It was all bad. He was on the wrong side of American nationalism at the time. So, in June 1918, he was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served as his own defense at trial. By the time he was sentenced, the war was over and he was 64 years old. At his trial, he tells the jury, "I have been accused of obstructing the war. I admit it. Gentlemen, I abhor war. I would oppose it if I stood alone." Still, he was convicted. He was sentenced to 10 years. President Wilson did not intervene, and Debs did go to prison. The Republican President Warren G. Harding, coming later, eventually pardoned Debs on Christmas Day, 1921, after he had spent 3 years behind bars. Incarcerated for giving voice to views that we can see upon reflection maybe didn't need to carry the day, who's to say? Maybe even, oughtn't to have. Maybe they weren't the winning voice. Maybe Debs was wrong at the end of the day. But they absolutely, upon reflection it seems, should have had a hearing. Absolutely did stand on a great deal of verifiable evidence and on a moral platform that was in many ways compelling. Debs is an example, one of many. A couple thousand people were prosecuted under these acts during this time. With them, the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press, so central to America's founding understanding of what constitutes democratic freedom, were made legally subordinate to the positive presentation of a war that was being waged ostensibly in the interest of establishing democratic freedom elsewhere. So you can see how that works, right? The foundation of American democracy was subordinated to positively talking about, saying nice things about a war where democracy was ostensibly being guaranteed for folks elsewhere. That we did not maintain or protect at home the freedoms and securities we warred for abroad was scandalous to many. The Sedition Act was repealed in 1920. It did seem that that's a sort of tacit admission that this was just one bridge too far. The Espionage Act remains a law, amended somewhat, but not in any way that really or sufficiently responds to the new challenges of the information age and, of technology. One question that lawmakers have faced is this: is the Espionage Act intended to prevent and punish treason? And does that include whistleblowers? Technology has increased the sheer bulk of classified material out there, as well as its copyability and its transportability, and the ability of the government to track it down when it has been copied and sent, to trace its digital footprint. The Espionage Act came about at a time when newsreels were cutting edge. That was the, avant-garde of media presentation. Now, widespread and thoroughgoing surveillance is the norm for so-called first world nations. Former NSA contractor Edward Snowden was charged under this act, the Espionage Act, for leaking classified documents on the NSA's surveillance program in 2013. Former Army Private Chelsea Manning, also convicted under this act. WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, charged under this act. And Reality Winner, former Air Force linguist and government contractor, was charged for leaking an NSA document that details Russia's interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. She was imprisoned. In the information age, these are the new faces of espionage. Back in the World War I era, when that face was the face of a socialist anti-war union organizer, his concern was the working class, the poor, and the conditions under which they were forced to labor. The war abroad to make the world safe for democracy was for him intimately connected to the conditions of workers in a quickly industrializing world. That industrialization created the momentum that I've argued in large part led to World War I, and that industrial momentum affected life and liberty and the possibility of happiness for those at home as well. The conditions under which people, including small children, were forced to work were abhorrent by modern-day standards. The productivity and efficiency, these were the measures of value for those in power. And there was a great deal of unrest about this in America during the World War I era. The Colorado Coalfield War of 1913 to 1914 saw the National Guard attacking striking coal miners. You can see them with some of the artillery that was developed in World War I, kind of in anticipation of World War I in that stockpiling, industrializing moment. And then, after the National Guard pulled out, coal companies themselves paid for private armies. At least 75 people died, probably many more. Just after World War I, the steel strike of 1919 saw 350,000 strikers. They shut down half of the U.S. steel industry, which was huge at the time. And then fear of communism and an anti-immigration stance, and the fear that that bill was used to turn public sentiment against the strikers. They lost. It would take another 15 years for steel to get a union, steel workers to get a union. These are just a couple of examples, some of the more sort of historically well-known examples out of many, many examples of labor unrest and protests, strikes, and sometimes riots that were happening during this era on the home front. This is we've got the battlefront and the home front. This is the struggle happening, one of the struggles happening on the home front. Because I'm an optimist, maybe, or at least oriented towards the future and inspired by the potential for positive change, or just, maybe just the possibility of a more just world, we focused on, and you read about, a strike that took place in Lawrence, Massachusetts in the winter of 1912, which has gone down in history as the Bread and Roses strike. It was the first large-scale industrial strike, and as you read, the strikers were immigrants, women and children for the most part. There were men involved, but by and large, women and children, and tens of thousands of them out in the streets within 2 days of the first 4 or 5 women who walked out. And as you read, the strike and the poem and the song was based on, this is a quote, the notion that in addition to the necessities for survival, people should have a sharing of life's glories. The direct causes weren't so poeticized or high-minded. In 1912, this was the textile capital of the U.S. The workers saw that there was a great disparity in wealth and power, a great collusion between the state and corporate interests, and and that collusion was seemed to be in the interest of increasing the suffering of the workers and their children, by little and by little ratcheting up the pressure of a daily soul-crushing grind that's only reward was continued poverty and often death. The slightest gain in decreased work hours, which you read happened, was met immediately with an increased workflow. The productivity would remain the same. The pay would remain the same. Now, the big win they'd been granted by the state legislature of Massachusetts was they just have to work faster, them and their children. The IWW, also known as the Wobblies, they helped out. For them, this is a quote, "An injury to one is an injury to all," and it's sort of their method and their model. For them, there will be no peace so long as the working class and the employing class are economically stratified. That's their mission statement, a state of it is the truth they hold to be self-evident. And victory here, in this instance, in this strike, required unity. And unity required respecting the differences. Strikers were from 50 different countries. They spoke 20 different languages. They were completely disenfranchised. They mostly had no education. They worked an incredible number of hours. Solidarity did not mean dissolving the difference. Solidarity was not the melting pot that we've heard about in previous units. It was a real recognition that each independent individual coming with their own culture met similar met similar challenges and therefore had to face them together. The direct causes for the strike were verifiable. They were in the world of logos, right? There were clear aspects of these working conditions, of the social contract between workers and employers, that needed to be changed. 54 hours, which is what they won, is just still way too long a work week for small children. 54 hours in a factory, right? But the strike became more than that. It became more than a strike for the the verifiable and very clear fact-based achievements, right? It organized itself not only around the need for legal protections and something closer, a closer approximation to fair wages, as Worley writes, who we read from food. We did read this from like a foodie mag, which concentrates on a real direct experience and thinks about it in terms of immediacy and relationship. But Worley writes, this became a political movement whose demand is mere subsistence, suffers from a poverty of the imagination. You read that, I'll read it one more time. A political movement whose demand is mere subsistence, suffers from a poverty of the imagination. If all you're looking for is survival, that's not much of a movement, right? I mean, it is, because survival is foundationally important. But what these workers did was really take it, they took it to another level. They would have bread, but they would have roses too. They would have basic protections under the law, yes, but they would have the promise fulfilled as well of all that high-minded idealism that we were fighting a war for, ostensibly. Not just life, but liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not just equality under the law, but human equality, inalienable and self-evident. You read the "We Shall Overcome" article. You read that it has a history, that song has a history in labor movements and civil rights movements alike. And unlike the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which also has sort of a history in a number of movements, social movements, this song, "We Shall Overcome," depends on the experience of already struggling, of being in that struggle, right? It doesn't unify around winning or a full-throated commitment to war, right? It's a song that sets its jaw, right? That it's at once an acknowledgement of intolerable circumstances that you're living in, and also a refusal to accept those circumstances. The greatest generation, as the World War I folks have been called, that generation wasn't only unified in mobilizing for the war to end all wars. It wasn't only making the world safe for democracy abroad. It was facing intolerable circumstances at home and struggling to make this nation answer to its promises for democracy, equality, liberty, and justice. The promises that it was taking the military on tour to secure. Some great strides were made by labor during this era, and the Bread and Roses strike is one of them. It had an enormously influential historical impact. But this era was also one of the lowest points in American race relations. For Native communities, this was an era of forced conversion of boarding schools, of outlawing traditional Native ritual practices and ritual objects. This was an era of assimilationist federal policies of the kill the Indian, save the man motif, of those kind of projects, like the infamous Carlisle School, whose founder coined that phrase, total assimilationist policies. And then the Johnson-Reed Act was passed in 1924, totally banning immigration from Asia. It was really, the propaganda around it did focus on Japan. China had already been cut off, but now all of Asia was banned from immigrating, and severely limiting immigration from all countries in the Eastern Hemisphere. And also Europe, also formed the Border Patrol at the U.S.-Mexican border, the Johnson-Reed Act. So, in large part, race relations were pretty abysmal. For Black Americans, this was the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow laws were passed between 1890 and 1908 and upheld for decades after. What you're seeing here is some signs from sundown towns. Sundown warnings were very common at this time. They were enacted in towns across the country. Any black person there after sundown would be killed. Some towns did have sundown laws when referring to applying directly to Japanese people. A group that was pretty clearly oppressed, not just in fact and deed, but also in signage on the outside of towns. But it was focused primarily on Black Americans. Birth of a Nation came out in 1915, leading to the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, which President Grant, as you remember, had pretty much squelched in the years immediately following the Civil War. The film was screened in Wilson's White House. You see at the bottom there was a quote from Wilson included in the film. He's quoted celebrating the Klan in the movie. It did get, NAACP did protest it. It was protested at the time, but it was also called the greatest picture of all time. And played to sold-out shows across America. Wilson had also already segregated all federal workplaces in 1913. This is the worst period for lynchings in America, the first wave of erecting Confederate war statues across the country, not just in the South or the former Confederate states, across the country. In 1917, economic strikes become riots of race violence, and Black people are killed in cities across the country. In 1919, in what's known as the Red Summer, race riots and white supremacist terror took over dozens of U.S. cities. Hundreds died. In 1921, the Tulsa Massacre happened. 1,200 homes in an affluent Black neighborhood were destroyed. Thousands were displaced. 10,000 Black Americans were rendered homeless. Hundreds were killed. White men in small private planes dropped burning turpentine balls on buildings. That's how they got the conflagration to completely decimate the infrastructure. And Black men, you got to remember, had just demobilized, as the entire army did from World War I, having fought to make the world safe for democracy in segregated battalions. The military was segregated, right? And this is the return. In what came to be known as the Great Migration, which happened from about 1915 until about 1935, Black people in the South fled to northern cities. Close to 2 million people trying to escape this terror and violence made their way to Chicago, Detroit, Harlem. Now, what they found there wasn't exactly the promise of liberty and equality and freedom and democracy and justice. It was marginally better, though, than the white supremacist terror that was happening in the South. And in some communities, especially places like Harlem, a real vibrant community developed. And we've talked a little bit about, through Langston Hughes, we talked a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance. Here's another figure from him whom you've read for today, and we'll close with America from 1921. Claude McKay. Claude McKay's poem, which is itself has been written down as something of an optimistic text. I'll read the first 6 lines for you here. It's a sonnet, which means 14 lines of iambic pentameter. I'll read the first 6. Although she feeds me bread of bitterness and sinks into my throat her tiger's tooth, stealing my breath of life, I will confess I love this cultured hell that tests my youth. Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me strength erect against her hate. Like Langston Hughes, like Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells, this poem insists that somehow America contains the resources required for its own redemption. Her vigor flows like tides into my blood, giving me strength erect against her hate. Like something of the American strength, vigor, those resources, something in America actually McKay is actually able to, at least in the voice of the poem, be strengthened by that against the hate that's being never-endingly lobbied against him, right? You remember Hughes, right? Finding the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. Hughes tells us, that he yet swears this oath: America will be, remains committed to the promise of a nation whose ideals, despite their betrayal, despite their constant, never-ending, soul-crushing betrayal, holds something that can be manifested, that is possible. That liberty and justice for all isn't a dream rendered impossible by human greed, by human fear, by human power, by human isolationist policies and racism. That it is possible. And so this poem is once more, giving me strength erect against her hate, drawing from the resources of the nation in order to articulate a potential redemption. So next time we will turn to World War II, by which point it turns out the world had not yet been made safe for democracy.